Michael checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. He was late, and the last bus was his only option. His hands were trembling from the cold, and his breath came out in quick, visible puffs. He cursed under his breath, the dim glow of the streetlights doing little to comfort him as he stood at the nearly abandoned bus stop. The streets of Silver Creek, a small town on the outskirts of New York, were eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around your throat, that making you feel uneasy without knowing why. No cars, no pedestrians, just an unsettling stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. Michael had always been somewhat of a night owl, but this night felt off. Something in the air was wrong, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. At 11:58 p.m., just as he was about to give up and consider walking the 5 miles home, the bus rolled into view, its headlights piercing the darkness like twin eyes glaring at him. The bus was old, much older than the usual buses that ran the route. Its paint was chipped, faded, and rusted in places. The windows were so grimy that it was impossible to see inside. Finally, Michael muttered to himself as he climbed aboard, swiping his bus pass across the scanner. The driver, a tall, thin man with pale, leathery skin, gave him a stiff nod. His eyes were sunken, dark and devoid of emotion. Michael shivered involuntarily and walked past without another word. As he made his way down the aisle, his eyes swept over the other passengers. There were only a few people scattered across the seats, but something about them made Michael feel uneasy. They all sat eerily still, their faces turned toward the front of the bus, as if they were in some kind of trance. No one acknowledged his presence. No one even blinked. Michael took a seat near the back, far enough from the others to feel some sense of solitude, but close enough to the door for a quick exit if needed. The air inside the bus was stale, filled with the faint scent of decay. He pulled his hoodie tighter around him and stared out the window, trying to distract himself from the gnawing feeling in his gut. Minutes passed. The bus rumbled along the dark, empty streets, the only sound the mechanical hum of the engine. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced back at the other passengers, hoping to catch someone's eye, to maybe strike up a conversation and ease his nerves. But when he looked again, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. None of them were breathing. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe the low light was playing tricks on him. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. Their chests didn't rise or fall. Their skin was a sickly grayish hue, and their eyes, those that weren't obscured by shadows, were glassy, empty. Jesus, Michael whispered under his breath, his heart beginning to pound. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Were they dead? Could it be some kind of prank? He leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look at the man sitting closest to him. The man's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his mouth slightly open, frozen in a grotesque half-smile. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, unblinking. His clothes were old, tattered, and stained with something dark that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Michael's stomach churned. He quickly turned his gaze back to the window, trying to control his breathing. This isn't happening. He told himself, it's just a bad dream, a really bad dream. The bus continued on, the outside world a blur of dark buildings and empty streets. Michael's eyes darted to the front of the bus, where the driver sat. The man hadn't moved an inch since Michael had boarded. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his face as expressionless as the passengers. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the eerie silence. He fumbled to pull it out, grateful for the distraction. A text from his friend Lisa. "Hey, did you make it home?" He stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "No, on the bus. Weirdest shit ever. I think something's wrong with the people on here. They look dead. Like, actually dead." He hit send and waited. The seconds felt like hours as the bus rumbled on, turning down a street Michael didn't recognize. His phone buzzed again. "What do you mean dead? Get off the bus if you can." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He glanced out the window. The streets were unfamiliar now, even though he had taken this route hundreds of times. The buildings looked older, abandoned. Some didn't even look like they belonged in this century, with crumbling stone facades and boarded-up windows. Suddenly, the bus lurched to a stop. Michael's head snapped up, and his eyes darted toward the door. But the bus wasn't at a normal stop. It was in the middle of an alley, dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight. The doors hissed open, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a figure stepped aboard. It was a woman, or at least what once had been a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow black voids. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her head tilting unnaturally as she scanned the passengers. Her gaze finally settled on Michael. A cold wave of fear washed over him as she began to walk down the aisle, her feet making no sound on the worn floor. Her lips twisted into a hideous grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellowed. Michael froze. His body was screaming at him to run, to get off the bus, but he couldn't move. His hands gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white with tension. His throat felt tight, and the air seemed to grow colder with every step she took. She stopped next to him, her hollow eyes staring down at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice raspy and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "This is not your bus." Michael's mouth went dry. "What the hell are you talking about?" he managed to croak out, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer, her cold breath washing over his face. It smelled of rot and decay. "You need to leave, before it's too late." Suddenly, the other passengers, those silent, unmoving corpses, began to stir. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their heads turned toward him. Their eyes, now glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto him with a predatory hunger. The woman's grin widened. "They're waiting for you." Michael's survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he shot up from the seat and bolted toward the front of the bus. His legs felt like lead, and his vision blurred as panic consumed him. The driver remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if oblivious to the horror unfolding behind him. Michael reached the doors, slamming his fist against the emergency release button. Nothing happened. "Let me out," he shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me off this goddamn bus." But the doors remained firmly shut. Behind him, he could hear the shuffling of feet, the soft groans of the once-dead passengers as they began to rise from their seats. Their movements were slow, jerky, but deliberate. They were coming for him. Desperate, Michael turned to the driver, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him violently. "Open the door," he screamed. The driver's head lolled to the side, and for the first time, Michael saw his face up close. His skin was decaying, his eyes hollow and lifeless, maggots writhing in the sunken flesh around his mouth. Michael stumbled back, horror flooding every fiber of his being. The dead were everywhere, and they wanted him. Suddenly, the woman's voice echoed through the bus, soft and mocking. "It's too late, Michael. You're one of us now." And in that moment, he realized with sickening clarity that there was no escape. The old bus had been rattling along the cracked and faded highway for hours. It was one of those obsolete relics, the kind that shouldn't have been on the road, but somehow managed to keep chugging along. The driver, a grizzled man named Jim, looked as ancient as the bus itself. He had a stoic expression, eyes hidden behind a pair of well-worn aviator glasses. Inside, the passengers were a mix of anxious and bored. There were families heading to remote cabins, college students heading home, and a few lone travelers lost in their thoughts. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a sense of unease began to settle over the bus. "Are we nearly there yet?" a young woman in the front asked, her voice laced with frustration. Her name was Lisa, and she had been checking her watch every few minutes. Jim didn't respond immediately. He simply grunted and adjusted his cap. His silence only added to the growing tension among the passengers. The bus veered off the highway onto a narrow gravel road. The transition was abrupt, the bus swaying as it struggled over the uneven surface. "Where are we going?" someone from the back shouted. "This isn't on the map." Jim's voice came through the intercom, rough and gravelly. "Just a shortcut. We'll get back on track soon." But the road only grew narrower and more overgrown. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The sun's last rays filtered through the canopy, casting eerie shadows that danced along the bus's path. The bus jolted suddenly. A loud bang echoed through the vehicle, followed by a grating, metallic screech. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The sudden darkness was oppressive, filled only with the muffled sounds of startled gasps and murmurs. What happened? Lisa's voice trembled, her phone's dim flashlight illuminating her anxious face. I'm not sure, Jim said, but it looks like we've got a flat tire. The bus came to a halt. The darkness outside was absolute, and the silence that followed was unnerving. There was no moonlight, no stars, just a pitch-black void that swallowed the bus. Well, this is just great, muttered a middle-aged man named Tom, who was sitting near the back, stranded in the middle of nowhere with a busted bus. Jim stepped off the bus with a flashlight, his figure momentarily illuminated against the darkness. The other passengers watched through the windows, trying to peer through the inky blackness. Minutes turned into hours. Jim's flashlight beam danced around the area as he worked on the tire. The darkness outside seemed to pulse, as though something were moving just beyond the edge of the light's reach. What is that? Whispered Emily, a college student who had been watching intently. Her eyes were wide with fear as she pointed toward the darkness. The others leaned in, trying to see what she was pointing at. A faint, distorted sound reached them, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the woods. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence followed the sound, amplifying the fear that was creeping through the bus. Jim finally returned, looking more agitated than before. It's no use. The spare tire's in worse shape than I thought. We'll have to wait until morning for help. No way, Lisa protested. We can't stay here. There's something out there. The passengers huddled together, their fears growing as the night wore on. The bus's interior, usually warm and safe, now felt like a fragile shell against the encroaching darkness outside. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the roof of the bus. The passengers screamed and scrambled, trying to see through the windows. The bus swayed slightly, and the lights flickered back on for a brief moment, revealing the dark silhouettes of trees closing in around them. Jim, what's happening? Someone shouted. I don't know, Jim replied, his voice shaking. He reached for the intercom, but found it dead. He was about to go outside again when a low, unearthly wail echoed through the night, sending shivers down everyone's spines. The bus was now under siege. The sounds of scratching and scraping came from all sides, as if unseen creatures were trying to get in. The passengers huddled in their seats, eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the bus. A shadowy figure appeared in the emergency exit, a face obscured by a hood. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, causing the passengers to recoil in horror. Stay away, Tom yelled, grabbing a fire extinguisher and wielding it like a weapon. The figure paused, then slowly retreated into the darkness. We have to get out of here, Emily cried, her voice trembling. We can't stay on this bus. Jim shook his head. It's too dangerous outside. We have to stay inside until morning. The night dragged on with increasing terror. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and strange, almost rhythmic noises echoed through the woods. The passengers whispered among themselves, sharing their fears and speculations. What if this is all a trap? Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if they're toying with us? The words hung in the air, fueling the growing paranoia. No one slept. Every creak and groan of the bus was magnified by the darkness, and every shadow outside seemed to conceal an impending threat. As dawn approached, the first light of morning broke through the trees. The bus was eerily quiet, the sounds of the night having faded. Jim, who had managed to catch a few hours of restless sleep, emerged from the bus, squinting against the morning light. The scene outside was almost surreal. The forest was empty, the shadows now just trees and underbrush. The road was still blocked, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. The passengers slowly emerged from the bus, their faces pale and drawn. They looked around, expecting to see the horrors of the night, but finding only the normalcy of the early morning forest. What happened? Tom asked, his voice hoarse. Where did they go? Jim shrugged. I don't know, but I'll call for help and get us out of here. As they waited for help to arrive, the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The night had left them shaken, and the darkness had revealed a fear they had never known. Finally, a tow truck arrived, and the bus was pulled back onto the highway. The passengers, still in shock, boarded the bus once more. The forest behind them was now just an ordinary part of the landscape, but the memory of that night would linger in their minds. As the bus continued on its way, Lisa looked out the window, her heart still racing. The forest seemed to watch them, the trees like silent sentinels keeping their secrets. The road ahead was clear, but the darkness of the night had left an indelible mark. In the end, they had escaped the terror of the forest, but they carried with them a lingering sense of unease. The forgotten route had shown them a glimpse of something beyond their understanding, and the darkness had left a shadow that would follow them long after they had left the woods behind. In the quiet of her apartment weeks later, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The night after the incident, her phone rang at midnight. The caller ID was blocked. She answered, her voice trembling. "Hello?" There was only silence on the other end, and then, just before she hung up, she heard a low, guttural growl, an echo of the terror from that fateful night. And she knew that the darkness of the forest had never really left. Lily's heart was still racing as she left the dimly lit birthday party. The chill in the night air seemed to wrap around her like a cold embrace, and she shivered despite her heavy coat. She had enjoyed the evening with her friends, but now, as she walked alone down the empty streets of the suburban neighborhood, the sense of isolation began to gnaw at her. The party had been in a remote area of town, a place where the houses stood far apart and streetlights were few and far between. It wasn't the sort of place where Lily felt particularly comfortable after dark, but she had no other choice but to walk to the bus stop. Her phone was dead, and the area wasn't known for its taxis. As she approached the bus stop, Lily noticed a man standing on the other side of the street. He was tall and thin, with a long, dark coat that billowed slightly in the wind. His face was obscured by the shadows of his hood, but she could feel his eyes on her, even from a distance. "Maybe he's just waiting for the same bus," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. She pulled her coat tighter and quickened her pace, hoping that the bus would arrive soon. When the bus finally rolled up, she was relieved to see that it was relatively empty. She climbed aboard and took a seat toward the back, trying to ignore the lingering sense of dread. The man from the street followed her onto the bus and, to Lily's growing anxiety, sat directly behind her. There were only a few other passengers scattered around, and the quiet hum of the engine was almost oppressive. Lily tried to focus on the city lights outside, but every time she glanced back, she could feel the man's gaze burning into her. His presence was unsettling. He didn't seem to move or make any noise, but she knew he was there. The stillness was more terrifying than any noise could have been. Every so often, she would hear a faint rustling sound coming from behind her, as if he were shifting in his seat. Each sound sent shivers down her spine. She could almost imagine his breath on the back of her neck, though she dared not turn around to confirm it. "Are you all right?" A voice broke the silence. Lily turned to see a middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle, her face lined with concern. "I'm fine," Lily replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Just a little tired." The woman gave her a sympathetic smile before turning her attention back to her book. Lily wished she could do the same, but the man's presence behind her was too consuming. Her mind raced with every possible worst-case scenario. When the bus finally pulled up to the stop nearest to her home, Lily almost jumped out of her seat in relief. She quickly made her way to the exit, her footsteps echoing through the empty bus as she left. She could hear the man's footsteps following closely behind her, and she quickened her pace. Outside, the night air was even colder. Lily darted down the street, her breath coming out in visible puffs. She glanced back and saw the man emerging from the bus, his shadow stretching long in the streetlight. Panic surged through her, and she ran faster, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached her house and fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She finally managed to unlock the door and slammed it shut behind her, locking it with frantic haste. She leaned against the door, trying to calm her racing heart. After a moment, she dared to peek out the window. The man was standing across the street, his gaze fixed intently on her house. His face was still hidden in shadow, but she could feel his stare like a physical weight. She backed away from the window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What is he doing? She wondered aloud, her mind spinning with fear. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just waiting for a ride or for someone else. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The way he looked at her, the way he followed her, it was intentional. Lily spent the next few hours in a state of hyper-awareness. She checked every lock on the doors and windows, peered out every window to see if the man was still there, though he was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, she reported the incident to the police. They took her statement and assured her they would investigate, though they seemed skeptical about the man's intentions. They told her it was probably a coincidence and that she should be cautious but not overly alarmed. For a while, Lily felt somewhat reassured. She went about her daily life, though with a heightened sense of vigilance. Every time she saw a man in a dark coat, her heart would skip a beat, only to settle when she realized it wasn't him. Weeks went by and she began to let her guard down. Life seemed to return to normal, until one day she saw a news report about a man who had been arrested for stalking multiple women in the area. The description matched the man from the bus exactly. Lily felt a wave of relief wash over her. He was caught, and she was safe. 2 months later, Lily decided to take a late-night bus to a 24-hour grocery store. It was a routine trip, nothing out of the ordinary. As she settled into her seat, she noticed a familiar figure boarding the bus. Her heart sank as she saw the man from the bus, his coat, his stance, the shadowy face. He took the seat right behind her. Lily's hands trembled as she clutched her purse tightly. She could feel the same unsettling presence that had haunted her months before. She wanted to get off the bus, but she was too afraid to move. The bus ride felt interminable, each stop dragging on longer than the last. The man's breathing was almost audible, and Lily could feel her own heart pounding in her ears. She dared not look back, but the fear was palpable, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating fog. When the bus finally reached her stop, she bolted off, her legs barely able to carry her as she ran towards her house. She made it inside, locking the door behind her, but the fear still clung to her. She sat by the window, peering into the darkness, waiting for any sign of the man. As the hours ticked by, she wondered if she would ever feel safe again. The man was never found that night, and Lily continued to live in a state of constant vigilance. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never completely left her. Every shadow, every unfamiliar figure sent a shiver down her spine. The open-ended terror of not knowing whether he would come back, or if he ever truly left, haunted her every day. And as the seasons changed and the nights grew longer, Lily was left with the chilling realization that the fear might never truly end. The moon hung high and cold over the American Midwest, casting an eerie light over the deserted highway. Amelia Wright, a 22-year-old college student, had taken the late-night bus from her small town to visit a friend in the city. Exhausted from the long day of exams and work, she had fallen asleep almost immediately after finding her seat. The rhythmic rumble of the bus, combined with the gentle sway of the vehicle, lulled her into a deep slumber. When she awoke, it was to a cold, unsettling darkness. Her initial confusion quickly gave way to panic. The bus was no longer moving. The soft hum of the engine was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to smother every sound. Amelia rubbed her eyes and glanced around. The bus, once so familiar, now seemed unfamiliar and menacing. The seats, once plush and comfortable, were now torn and stained. The dim emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. As Amelia stood up, she noticed a foul smell, a rank, nauseating odor that seemed to cling to the air. Her heart pounded as she stumbled toward the front of the bus, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty vehicle. The stench grew stronger with each step, a nauseating mix of decay and something far more sinister. When she reached the front, Amelia stopped dead in her tracks. The driver's seat was empty, but the dashboard was smeared with dark stains. Her eyes were drawn to a pool of congealed blood near the door. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, this can't be real," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. A sudden noise startled her, a scraping sound from the back of the bus. Amelia turned around, her eyes wide with fear. The noise grew louder, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. She swallowed hard, trying to convince herself that it was just a trick of the shadows, or perhaps a wild animal that had wandered in. But then she saw it, a shadow moving in the flickering light, its shape elongated and twisted. Amelia's hands shook as she tried to turn on her phone's flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. The bus was filled with abandoned belongings. A child's teddy bear with a missing eye, a half-open book stained with what looked like old coffee, and a photograph of a smiling family, now smeared with blood. The most chilling part was the blood smeared on the seats and the walls, forming grotesque patterns and symbols that made no sense. A soft, mournful cry echoed through the bus. Amelia's breath hitched. She turned around and saw a figure slumped in one of the seats, shrouded in shadows. Her flashlight's beam caught the glint of something metallic, a silver locket hanging from the figure's neck. It was a young woman, her face obscured by darkness, but unmistakably lifeless. No, Amelia muttered, backing away. Her back hit the wall as the figure's head slowly turned toward her. The eyes, though lifeless, seemed to stare directly into her soul. Amelia's knees felt weak, and she almost collapsed as she struggled to keep her composure. Suddenly a voice broke the silence. "Why are you here?" It was a whisper, barely audible, yet it seemed to reverberate through the entire bus. Amelia spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. No response, only the oppressive silence and the occasional flicker of the lights. Amelia's phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down to see a message from an unknown number. "Get out before it's too late." She tried to make sense of the message, but panic was taking over. She needed to leave, but the bus seemed to have no exit. The doors, once functional, were now rusted shut, and the windows were fobbed up and coated with grime. She pounded on the door, desperate to get out, but it wouldn't budge. The scraping noise grew louder again, more insistent. Amelia turned her flashlight towards the back of the bus, where she saw a horrifying sight. Figures, dark and twisted, were crawling towards her. Their eyes glowed with a ghostly light, and their mouths moved soundlessly, as if trying to scream. Terror gripped Amelia, and she stumbled back towards the driver's seat, hoping to find some form of escape. She fumbled with her phone, trying to call for help, but the signal was dead. The oppressive darkness and the creeping figures seemed to close in on her. The lights flickered one last time before going out entirely, plunging the bus into complete darkness. Amelia's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in pitch blackness. The figures were now right beside her, their cold, clammy hands reaching out. She could feel their presence, the icy breath of the dead against her skin. A sudden, blinding light pierced the darkness. Amelia shielded her eyes, and when she looked up, she was outside the bus. The scene was surreal. The bus was parked in a decrepit lot, surrounded by rusting vehicles and broken-down machinery. The night air was crisp, and the oppressive sense of dread had lifted somewhat. She turned back to the bus, but it was gone. The lot was empty, save for a few scattered items of trash. Amelia's heart was still racing as she stumbled away from the lot, her mind reeling from the nightmarish experience. As she reached the edge of the lot, she glanced back one last time. The bus had vanished, leaving no trace of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and began to walk towards the nearest town, determined to put the nightmare behind her. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see the twisted figures from the bus. The night seemed to stretch endlessly before her, filled with shadows and whispers. The next morning, Amelia was found wandering along the highway, disoriented and traumatized. She was taken to the hospital where she tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. The bus was reported missing, and no trace of it or the other passengers was ever found. To this day, Amelia avoids traveling by bus, and the memory of that night haunts her dreams. Sometimes, when she's alone and the darkness is particularly thick, she can still hear the faint echoes of the mournful cries and scraping sounds from that fateful bus ride. The terror she experienced remains with her, a chilling reminder of the night she encountered the ghostly remnants of a tragedy long forgotten. And the bus, wherever it is now, waits in the darkness, ready to claim its next unsuspecting passenger. In the small, forgotten town of Wexford, where the trees grew twisted and the fog never seemed to lift, there was a bus driver named Harold Finch. Harold had worked for Wexford Transit for 20 years, and in all that time, he had seen some strange things. But nothing prepared him for what happened one cold, misty evening in October. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a heavy gray. Harold's old bus, a rickety thing from the 90s, rattled and groaned as it trundled down the empty streets. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced on the cracked sidewalks. Harold sighed, glancing at the empty seats. It had been a slow night, and he was looking forward to heading home. The bus's heater wheezed softly, barely making a dent in the chill that seeped through the windows. He glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. Just one more round, then he could call it a night. The bus screeched to a halt at the next stop, and Harold peered out into the gloom. A small group of passengers shuffled onto the bus. They were an odd bunch, their clothing old-fashioned, like something out of a time-worn photograph. They wore long coats and hats, their faces hidden in shadows. Not a single one of them spoke or made eye contact. Harold frowned, sensing an unsettling vibe from the group. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that he dealt with all kinds of people over the years. He watched as the strangers found their seats, their movements stiff and mechanical. He continued his route, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his silent passengers. Their faces remained obscured, their heads bowed as if in mourning. The bus journey seemed to stretch longer than usual, and the air grew heavier with every mile. At each stop, Harold expected someone to get off, but no one did. The streets of Wexford seemed to grow darker and more deserted with each passing moment. Harold felt a shiver run down his spine, his breath fogging up the glass. As the bus approached the final stop on the route, Harold felt a growing sense of dread. The destination was an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place where few ventured, especially at night. The cemetery was surrounded by a wrought iron fence, and the gate was always locked tight. The bus came to a halt, and Harold turned to address his passengers. "This is the last stop, folks," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're at the cemetery. This is where you get off." One by one, the passengers stood up and moved toward the door. Harold's heart pounded as he watched them exit the bus. They moved with an eerie grace, their footsteps barely making a sound on the pavement. As the last passenger stepped off the bus, Harold felt a sudden chill. He turned to look at them, and for the first time, he saw their faces clearly. His blood ran cold. The passengers weren't just old-fashioned. They were skeletal, their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions frozen in a mournful grimace. Harold's hand trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but the sight of them was burned into his memory. He watched as they drifted toward the cemetery gate, their forms dissolving into the fog. The gate creaked open, and they disappeared into the darkness. Harold's breath came in short gasps. He glanced at the bus's clock. 10:15 p.m. The journey had taken longer than usual. He looked back at the cemetery, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave. He started the bus, his hands shaking as he drove away from the graveyard. But as he made his way back through the fog-shrouded streets, he noticed something strange. The bus's rearview mirror was fogged up, but there were faint, ghostly figures visible through the condensation. They seemed to be following him, their forms shifting and wavering. Harold's panic grew with each mile. He tried to shake off the eerie feeling, but the figures remained, haunting his every turn. The bus's interior lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the seats. He decided to make an unscheduled stop at the old diner on the edge of town, hoping to clear his mind. As he pulled into the diner's lot, He noticed something unsettling. The diner's neon sign, usually bright and welcoming, was now dim and flickering. He stepped off the bus, his breath visible in the cold air. The diner's door creaked open, and Harold entered, hoping to find some comfort. The place was empty, the tables and chairs scattered haphazardly. The only sound was the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Harold approached the counter and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response. He felt a creeping sense of unease. The clock ticked louder, each second stretching into an eternity. He turned to leave, but as he did, he saw a figure sitting in one of the booths. It was a man, dressed in a suit from another era, his face obscured by shadows. Harold's heart raced. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man slowly looked up, revealing hollow eyes and a mournful expression. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a hollow whisper. Harold nodded, unable to speak. The man continued, "They're not supposed to be seen. They're trapped, just like me. They were lost souls, forever bound to that cemetery." The man's words sent a shiver down Harold's spine. He backed away, stumbling toward the door. As he left the diner, he glanced back to see the man vanish into thin air. Harold returned to the bus, his mind reeling. He had to finish his route and get out of Wexford. He drove through the foggy streets, his senses on high alert. As he approached the cemetery again, he saw something horrifying. The cemetery gate was wide open, and the fog seemed to be swirling around it, forming ghostly shapes. The skeletal figures he had seen earlier were emerging from the fog, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Harold's breath caught in his throat. He tried to drive past, but the bus wouldn't move. It was as if the fog had ensnared it, holding it in place. The figures grew closer, their mournful wails filling the air. Desperately, Harold tried to start the bus, but the engine sputtered and died. The figures reached the bus, their skeletal hands pressing against the windows. Harold could see their hollow eyes staring at him, their mouths moving silently. In that moment, Harold realized the truth. The bus wasn't just a vehicle, it was a gateway, and the souls he had seen were trapped, forever bound to the route he drove. The figures began to drift into the bus, their cold presence filling the space. Harold felt a chill unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was surrounded by the ghostly apparitions, their mournful wails growing louder. As the figures closed in on him, Harold's vision blurred. He felt a cold, bony hand touch his shoulder, and everything went dark. The next morning, the bus was found abandoned at the cemetery gate. The only thing inside was the driver's empty seat and the faint echo of mournful whispers. Harold Finch was never seen again, and the townspeople of Wexford spoke of the ghostly bus that roamed the streets, carrying lost souls to their final destination. And so, the tale of Harold Finch became another chapter in Wexford's dark history. A cautionary tale of a bus ride that should never be taken, and the souls forever trapped in the fog.